Everybody, this is Anthony Brogdon. I'm back at you on Strong Inspirations. I got one of them PhD type guys on the channel again. I find them cats, man, and they know that history so well. They come on, they say, hey, man, what you want me to talk about? I say, whatever you want to talk about. And I just ask a question to get, move the conversation along. He said, hey, I got you. I know what I'm doing. I said, cool, let's roll. So everybody, it's Anthony Brogdon on Strong Inspirations. I want you to hit that subscribe button. I want it, and it's free. I want you to hit the like button on this video for sure, because my man know what he's talking about. He got books behind him. He probably read all of them in one night, one of them speed reading kind of cats. So go and hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, because I'm putting up videos every week, and you want to be on point, so you know when it's happening. You can sit back and carve yourself about 30 to 40 minutes out and watch this good history, all right? This good American history with an emphasis on Black history. And also, everybody, come on now, take a minute. I know my sales is up because I can feel it. I got a movie out. It's titled Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. I say it with a smile because this is my baby right here. I love it. I sleep with it under my pillow. It came out in 2017 after 2 years of working on it, of doing the research and doing the filming and so on and so forth. And I took it to almost 40 cities on my own dime. I'm in Michigan. I went as far as Seattle, Washington with this movie, and I had a packed house in the theater right up under that big Sky Dome, the seat, whatever that tower is in Seattle, right up under that. But I was a little scared to get up on it because it went too high, and I figured, hey, that's all right. But the movie is good. And this is the DVD right here. But at the same token, if you don't have no DVD player, and I understand that, it's streaming on Amazon. So you can watch it on your computer, your laptop, or on your smart TV, so on and so forth. 75 minutes long, and you will be really happy you watched this. And then, I went a little bit further and I wrote the book. It's titled Black Business Book. It goes with the movie in many respects, some of the same facts, but this is so much more thorough because it's got over 200 facts. It's mind-blowing stuff. And so that's the book. It's really easy to read, if you're one of them kind of guys like me who just want to get right to the point and don't need a lot of commentary. I wrote it in that regard. So it's not hard reading, but it's mind-blowing. And it's going to blow your mind so much, you're going to have to say, where you find that fact? I number the fact, and then I cross-reference that to the link in the back of the book to where I found the fact. So that makes it easy, and you can understand, and you can look further at that point. So come on and get a copy of my book. It's also on Amazon. You know that Amazon, he got it all, man. Oh my God. And if you want to cut the big Amazon man out, just go to my website, inspirationsbystrong.com. You can go there and get them both. And even if you get it off Amazon or wherever you get it, I'm so happy. And I'm happy enough that I autograph it. All right. That might mean something one day. I got a feeling it will, because this thing is taking off. I thank you for being on my show and watching us again. And I can feel it. People calling me now saying, man, I like what you're doing. I know somebody. And what happened was the guy on the show today, I sent him an email. I found him somewhere and sent him an email. And he was like, yeah, call me in. I'll do it. Yeah. And so here we are, ready to roll. So come on, sir, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and let's get it on.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for having me on here. My name is Aaron Astor, and I'm a professor of American history here at Maryville College in Maryville, Tennessee, which is a small college, East Tennessee near Knoxville. And I do American history, teach pretty much all American history. My area I focus on is the middle of the 19th century, so the Civil War era, emancipation and Reconstruction, the South and African American history. There's pretty much the whole picture of the middle of the 19th century.
let me ask you, how did you want to do this for a career? How did you, like this kind of thing?
Well, it's a good question. So before I went off to graduate school, I lived in Washington, D.C. actually, and I didn't like what I was kind of bored with what I was doing, but I actually was really, I remember going to the Frederick Douglass House in Anacostia in Southeast DC.
Yeah, I've been
Um,
there.
and yeah, it's amazing. And, it's beautifully preserved and everything. And I started thinking about how much of, you know, the history of the city I was living in. And of course, it was heavily African-American city, not only in the 1990s when I was there, but back in the 19th century too. And Frederick Douglass's presence there was a big part of that. And I started thinking a lot about what had happened after the Civil War and after emancipation there. And I started reading more and more on it and got more into, eventually decided to switch careers. But I was always interested in kind of the upper South, the border South area, like Maryland or Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, or that area, because everybody talks about the deep South
Yeah,
or the North, but there's a whole, much of the country's in the middle, and that's where I always lived.
yeah,
And the story I always heard about the Civil War and Reconstruction, everything was always based on the true North and the South, but the middle was always sort of left out. And I was like,
yeah,
I knew the story had to be more complex there, and it was.
yeah.
So that's kind of how I got into it. But I was always interested in, Reconstruction is this incredible time when there are so many promises for African Americans in terms of possibilities of land
But
ownership.
let me stop you right there. Before you get into that, I want to just ask you, you kind of have to be a conscious kind of guy yourself to want to do this though, right? I mean,
Well,
kind
yeah,
of liberal thinking type person
yeah,
to give it a good slant to it, something like that, right?
I guess. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly was. Yeah. I mean, if you don't, if you're not sympathetic to the ideals behind all this, then it's probably not going to be something somebody's going to want to get into. But actually, that's kind of the point, though, was that a lot of what people know about it was distorted by the fact that there were so many advances for African Americans in the late 1860s and 70s that were basically forgotten.
Yeah. Oh,
I
for
mean, remember
sure.
when the movie Glory came out, in 1990,
Yeah.
and that was like a revelation. So many people had never, white and black, a lot of people had no idea that there were so many African Americans who fought for the Union Army in popular culture,
Yeah.
and it was like, what? Because it was one thing to talk about rights and civil rights movements and all that stuff, but it's another thing to see what happened on the ground and see what the lived reality was like for everybody and why our impressions of the whole period were distorted. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today, really, is
Yeah. Go ahead. Let's do it.
how historians do what they do. That's really, and so, right from the beginning, I was thinking about why exactly I was into that kind of thing.
Yeah. So now when we talk about it, in layman's terms, DC was a really a hotbed for the whole Civil War,
Sure.
the troops and everything.
Yeah.
I had a gentleman on the show that said that there was even a battle in DC.
Right. Fort Sanders.
Yeah, right.
Fort Stevens.
Yeah, he's in, and I didn't know that. I thought it was kind of hands off in DC. So that could have been like another insurrection almost, so to
right.
speak,
So
right?
DC was, of course, slavery was legal there right up until 1862. It was, it was known as a Southern city, and it was surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, of course, broke and joined the Confederacy. So it's got enemy territory right across the river. And that not only was Maryland a slave state, but the part of Maryland closest to Washington, D.C., like Prince George's County, Charles County, was the highest slave part of Maryland.
Really?
And yeah, so, when the war broke out, and see, one of the complicating things about emancipation was that, like, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the Union border states like Maryland. So slavery had to come apart through other mechanisms. Eventually, Maryland would itself vote to abolish slavery at the end of 1864. But the real thing that killed it off was Black men joining the Union Army. And but also in April of 1862, the District of Columbia, Congress actually abolished slavery in DC. And Frederick Douglass had commented that was the first time in American history that the US Congress had actually voted to free a slave anywhere. There were places that banned slavery, like going back to Pennsylvania. But when they did it, they always did it gradually. They would say, okay, those who are enslaved will stay enslaved, but maybe their kids will be free, or not only after they reach like 21 years old. So it's always gradual because they're worried about losing money for the slave holders and all or the big social, dislocation. But here in DC, I mean, I think they did compensate the slave holders, it's not the slaves, but but it did free them right away. And that was a big deal because that was really one of the first times during the Civil War that was clear that this war for union was becoming a war of emancipation. And that was in April of 62.
Okay.
So that was
So,
celebrated in the Black community in DC as Emancipation Day. It usually
so,
came around Easter.
so when
Um,
they freed them, what does that mean? Okay, today you're not, tomorrow you are.
Basically, yeah. And see, what's happening is a lot of African Americans from Maryland are moving into DC, especially after this happens. And it does raise this new question of what is going to be their status in terms of land, labor, civil rights, voting rights, all that stuff. I mean, that's another whole thing that's going to be raised at this point. That's the questions of Reconstruction. But that's coming in anywhere the Union Army goes in the South. Anywhere you have this question of it's one thing to destroy slavery, but then what is replacing it? And that's on nobody knows. It's uncertain, and it's all up in the air, which is why that era is so interesting, because it's like everybody's trying to make it up as they go along.
It's kind of amazing to come to this conclusion that there could be slavery right here, and as close as what, maybe another 3 miles down, there was no slavery.
Right.
Is that the closest it comes? Maybe within the 3 mile border? Is that
well? I mean, you have the literal Mason-Dixon line between Maryland and Pennsylvania, where slavery is legal on one side and not on the other, or the Ohio River between Cincinnati, Ohio, and northern Kentucky. I mean, that's why that river was so important. Cincinnati was there was no slavery there, so there was a free Black community there before the war, and slavery, of course, is legal in Kentucky. So you had people who were trying to run away, run to Cincinnati. And one of the points of tension leading up to the war, leading up to the Civil War, was that you had quote fugitives, runaway slaves running to cities like Cincinnati, and you'd have some abolitionists who would, and many were themselves Black, were shielding them, were trying to help them get their way up to Canada. And so a lot of Southern slaveholders complained that Northern states were not doing enough to hand them back over. So they passed this much bigger Fugitive Slave Act back in 1850. Which basically would give people more money if they just declared that somebody was a runaway slave, which encouraged kidnapping, and that led to a lot of African Americans from places like Cincinnati to just flee north. But it was very precarious, it was precarious there, but there's a lot of tension. These things could break, could explode at any moment.
Yeah, it's funny, folks. I've been doing this show for a little while, and I'm learning how this, as I talk to, these experts like this. There was, in some respects, a war in some of the new territories like Kansas.
Right, absolutely.
When the part of the people said, well, we want slavery, and the other part said, we don't. And they fought among themselves.
That's absolutely right. But it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the people who opposed slavery, they didn't necessarily support racial equality. I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of whites who opposed slavery, but they didn't want free Blacks either, including in Kansas. Like they wanted, they thought slavery was, they didn't really care what it meant for African Americans. I mean, a lot of them, they thought that slavery was essentially, they thought it was bad for whites. They thought it made white people not want to work as hard, or encourage some people to own all the land or whatever. So, the opposition to slavery in much of the North, among whites in the North, was not always, they support racial equality. In fact, rarely was it that. It was usually they thought slavery was doing something bad for them. And, that's often happens in history. People rarely do things just because it helps somebody else. They got to see what's in it for them. And as far as many whites in the North, in places like Ohio and Michigan were concerned, the thing that bothered them a lot was that they wanted whites, white farmers, whatever, they wanted their kids to be able to go west to get land in places like Kansas. And they worried that if slavery was open there, that slaveholders from South Carolina, whatever, would go out there and bring hundreds of slaves with them and take all the best land. And they said, no, we don't want that. So a lot of it was like, if you let slavery expand to the West, it means that the Northern, what they call free soil, free labor, was going to be constricted, and there would not be land available.
Was there ever anybody who really looked at enslaved people as humans and saying, hey, hold on, that person is got a heart, he's got a brain, he's got these and those things, that he's just a normal person. And your attitude towards them is really just inhumane in itself.
Oh, absolutely. There definitely were what we call moral abolitionists too. I mean, I'm not saying those people don't exist.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that they were not a very large part of the population in the North. They may have been the most vocal, and they may have given a lot of moral voice to the anti-slavery movement. But the reason why, so the Republican Party before the Civil War was, their thing was opposing slavery in the West. The reason that it grew so much, the reason why there were so many white Northerners who wanted to prevent slavery from going west was because it would have a bad effect on them. They thought that it was making the slaveholders dominate on Northern life, that it was making them dominate national politics. It was making them grab the best land in the West. So they're thinking about what it meant for them. Now, again, yes, some of them were absolutely thinking about in terms of the humanity.
Yeah.
And some religious and non-religious. Some people were thinking about it that way. But in terms of the raw numbers, in terms of getting voting power to support Lincoln through the war and emancipation, it's going to be a lot of it, this what they call free soil sentiment, which was that slavery in theory was bad, but they really care that it was ultimately bad for whites as well. So they tried to contain it. It's almost like what we did with communism in the Cold War. It was like, we're not going to go attack it, we're going to contain it, protect it from expanding, prevent it from expanding. So that's what the Republican Party was trying to do in the late 1850s. They're trying to contain it, like sort of cordon of freedom, so that way it wouldn't expand. And of course, the South said, if you contain us in, then we'll die out, and we're not going to let you do that. And you can see why that would,
Yeah, but I think in many regards, the Southern territories were even more powerful than the Northern territories.
Yes,
they didn't have more people, but they had more economic worth because that was before the Industrial Revolution and that kind of thing, right?
I mean, it was, what happened was that, the Constitution basically gave extra power to, slaveholders, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportioning members of Congress, right? So they had extra representation in Congress because of that. Obviously, it gave them a huge amount of wealth. I mean, people forget it's not just, as far as the slaveholders were concerned, the issue is not just that they were laborers, but they were also property, really, really, really expensive property. And the prospect of liquidating that property was something they were terrified of. I mean, in addition to the racial elements and the loss of labor power and all of that, it was also that, enslaved people were worth a ton of money during that period. And, of course, that encouraged this domestic slave trade, encouraged all kinds of other things. But it was, they were thinking that this was, but it gave them a lot of economic power. Cotton exports were huge. Definitely, so even within the South, the slaveholders, because the majority of whites in the South did not own slaves, but the politicians, the leadership was almost all slaveholders or very closely allied with them.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about Washington D.C., what were the slaves doing there? I mean, were there were there farming in D.C.?
There was some on the outskirts, but mostly it was domestic servants. So working in the hotels, I mean, working in the or public works, that kind of stuff. I mean, famously, building parts of the cap, building some of the big buildings of the government. They were, and you also had something called slave hiring, which was more common in the upper South, like Lexington, Kentucky, where someone was a slave, but they would be hired out to somebody else for part of the year. And sometimes enslaved people could actually bargain to get some of those, the pay for that and buy their own freedom. But it was, there was a little bit of farming too. I mean, the District of Columbia, see, for a long time, the city of Washington was actually smaller than the District of Columbia. Now they're the same thing. But for a while, the city of Washington was smaller and the outskirts was farmland. So yeah, it was like Maryland. And of course, farmland means to grow tobacco. It means there were slaves there that were essentially agricultural slaves, but that's the outskirts. Most enslaved people there were domestic. The other thing is that until 1850, it was also very important as a slave trading center. So there were slave pens both in the Washington, D.C. and across the river in Alexandria, Virginia, because slavery was gradually declining in Maryland and Virginia, and it was expanding in the Deep South in Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. So you had a lot of slaveholders that were selling their slaves in places like Washington, D.C. to be sold southward.
You say slave pens. What?
A slave pen, like a prison, basically. If you ever see a depiction of it in 12 Years a Slave,
Yeah.
about Solomon Northup, where he is kidnapped. Of course, he's free and he's kidnapped and he's thrown into it's called a slave pen. It's basically a prison. It's a jail where they're then auctioned off and sold.
Oh, you know, what is it like? Okay, you're in Washington D.C. or some free territory,
Yeah.
and not far is enslaved area. Do the enslaved areas do they walk freely with their slaves in those free territories? Do they let the slaves kind of?
I mean, well, at what point? I mean, during the war or
No,
during?
no, but even prior to the
No,
war.
no, not at all. No. So, some places had, like Maryland and Delaware, the Eastern Shore particularly, had one of the largest free Black populations before the Civil War. And, you know, there were certainly communities that were mixed with free and enslaved, but slave people were restricted in terms of where they could move. In fact, there were some states restricted where free people could move and work too. They would make them
Oh,
register.
really?
Yeah, they make them register. And actually it got even worse as you got close to 1861, because they were worried, the slaveholders were worried that free Blacks were encouraging slaves to rise up. They were worried about
Sure.
an insurrection would come, that free Blacks that would get, because they would always say, oh, it's these outside agitators, they'd always say like, oh, the slaves are happy where they are and they're being fed all this nastiness from outside people. And free Blacks were some of the people who they were worried about, but also white abolitionists.
There were stories, and I even account for them in my book and my film, where slaves were able to travel freely, or let's not say freely, quote quote freely, without their owner to northern territories. I have found instances where one lady, she was a fashion designer, had on Elizabeth Keckley. She had her own business. She was able to go up north without her slave owner to do business, send money back.
Some of them let them do that. But I mean, on a one-on-one basis, yeah, you might find examples. I mean, one-on-one basis, you'll find an example of anything. I mean, but and there are some examples of that, but by and large, they were restricted. And of course, again, it depends. There you have Washington D.C. with Keckley, but I mean, in Louisiana, well, New Orleans, you have some of that crossover. But I mean, in rural Louisiana, Mississippi, no, man, it's very much restricted.
Yeah. Are you able as a okay? So let's say again, I think I kind of asked this question, but let me see if I got it right. If I own slaves and I'm in one of those slave territories, do I go to areas where there are no slavery, where there is no slavery, just for business or whatever?
Are you talking about before the Civil War?
Okay, before or even during the Civil War.
Well, I mean, you go there because you might be free. I mean, before the war.
I'm not talking about the enslaved people. I'm talking about the slave owners. They travel freely among.
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, so one place this became a problem. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what you're saying. Yeah. In fact, one place where this became a problem was, like, some of them would literally go to like Princeton University and would wonder if they could take their slaves with them, or they go to these springs in the summertime to get away from the heat, and they go to the mountains and like Saratoga Springs in New York or something, and they would go there, and a lot of times they want to bring their slaves with them. And the law was basically that you could bring them for a short period of time as long as you didn't settle there. If you settled there, then they were going to be free. Okay. If you just move them in transit, or the other weird thing is, like, if you're going from Kentucky, which is a slave state, to Missouri, which is a slave state, you might cross Illinois because it cuts right between them, which is a free state. If you were traveling in transit, your slave was not free just because you're moving through there. Now, if you moved there and stayed there, it'd be a different story. So, in fact, the whole Dred Scott decision, the famous Supreme Court decision, actually had a lot to do with this question, because Dred Scott said his owner had moved him to Wisconsin and stayed there. But of course, the real issue there was that Wisconsin at the time was not a state, it was a territory. So it raised up other legal issues. But there was this question of, if you're just in transit or temporarily, then slaveholders would take the slaves with them. If it was permanent, then the slaves would be freed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, how does somebody tell the difference between a free Black person and an enslaved Black person?
Well, so this was actually one of the issues here, because the Constitution said that fugitive slaves, basically someone who runs from one state to another, could be returned to his owner in the other state. That the federal government could set up a law, and they did in 1792, that basically empowered one state to turn a runaway slave over to another state. But what happened was, a lot of northern states, because of the anti-slavery movement, passed what were called personal liberty laws. And what these things did was they said that if someone is accused of being a runaway slave, they have a right to a jury trial. And the jury trial will determine the facts of whether or not they think this person is actually a slave or is free. And Southern slaveholders were increasingly frustrated at this because they said that what's happening is that these slaves are running away to places with large free Black or abolitionist populations where no jury would ever determine that someone was a runaway slave. And so therefore, these personal liberty laws were essentially shielding, harboring these fugitives. So in 1850, Congress passed a new Fugitive Slave Act. And among other things, it established a federal commission, which could deputize any white Northerner to say you must catch a slave, and it would actually pay them more if the commission determined that someone was a slave and not. And so this actually reversed a lot of this and actually encouraged kidnapping. Free Blacks in places like Cincinnati who can now be kidnapped by someone saying, oh, that person's a slave, even though they weren't. Because it could be hard to prove. You have freedom papers, you might have stuff, evidence of it, but they might say, oh, they're forged. It's whose word do you trust? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, whose word do you trust? That's why it was very important for them to find someone who could protect them. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was designed to cut that off and say, no, here. And the irony here is that the South, when later on they talk about, oh, our states' rights, the federal government's getting away with states' rights, it was actually northern states that first were bothered by it, because they said that our state should be able to protect the right to a jury trial for people accused of being a runaway slave. And this federal Fugitive Slave Act is violating our state's rights. So in Wisconsin, there was a case that actually reached the Supreme Court called Abelman versus Booth. And the Supreme Court said, sorry, the federal Fugitive Slave Act is supreme over the state law, and therefore someone accused of being a runaway slave could be captured back. But that was a major change in 1850.
Yeah, I bet. When we first talked, you had specifically said that there was a topic or something, and I know we touched upon a bunch of things that you wanted to talk about. Have we touched on those?
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about was how historians do what we do.
Yeah,
because
right. There you go.
Everything I'm telling you right now. So everything I'm telling you right now, I mean, historians don't just describe things, right? We don't just describe facts. We don't just collect facts and dates and things and stuff. We try to interpret it. We try to make some sense out of it. Like, why were people doing what they're doing? And when you do that, you're going to have different interpretations, right? Different explanations of why, why did slavery end the way it did and so on.
Right.
So the question, what historians do is you're interpreting things, but you're interpreting things differently from each other. So this whole study of how historians interpret things is called historiography. That's the broader term for this. Okay. Historiography. So when it goes to graduate school, you learn historiography, which means you learn how do historians do what they do? How do historians change or reevaluate their interpretations of things? And the way this happens is a collection of stuff. Sometimes there's new evidence, right? Sometimes there's new records. Sometimes there's old records, but now somebody digitized them and now we can see them easier. You know what I mean? So sometimes it's just we have access to new information and that causes us to look at everything in a different light. But a lot of times it's because of the changing politics of the time of the historian, because historians are people too. And so historians writing in the 1920s, white historians writing in the 1920s, are going to be influenced by that world around them differently than those writing in the 2020s.
Sure.
The assumptions that they'll make about race, the assumptions that they'll make about why people did what they did. And so that is going to color how historians change their interpretation. It doesn't mean that they're wrong, one is right or wrong. It just means that it changes. It means you have to look at that next level of how and why do historians change their interpretations of things.
Is there an instance where you thought one way and new information came to light, or something that you didn't know came to light? And after all these years you've been doing it, is there something that you say, wow, I got it differently?
It's funny you say that. I literally just had to review a book that critiqued something I'd written about 10, 15 years ago. And it was smart. It was she posed the question differently than I did and used other information, changed the time scale, but she made a good point. I was talking about Missouri basically, and about whether or not people after the Civil War in Missouri were kind of downplaying those that they had supported the Union. because the area I looked at, that was the case during the time period. But this other historian looked longer into the late 19th century and looked more broadly and found no, there actually were people who were saying, yes, we're proud to be unions. And she criticized, and she was good. She read it well. And I had to write a review of her book, and I acknowledged, you know, that she had gone. So yeah, but she had access to other information that I hadn't seen. She, by extending the timeline out, she looked at record sources that I hadn't looked at. Sometimes the new one is wrong.
Can you yourself be impartial and be critical of the attitudes of enslaved owners?
Oh yeah, you can be critical. I mean, you don't have to. I don't think you have to be. I
mean, it's history, and it's nothing you could, you know, nothing we could do about it.
Well, I guess this is the difference between sympathizing and empathizing. I mean, empathizing is important because you want to understand their mentality and why they did what they did. Sympathizing means you actually approve of it. You know, actually.
Yes.
You know, empathy is important because even for terrible people in the past, because you need to understand why they did. You don't have to. But sympathizing is a different matter, because that means, you know, you're romanticizing whatever. And but that can be hard though, you know, because depending on who you are or how far away you are from something, you know, it's also harder to interpret things that are more recent because it's too close, you know. And sometimes we need time to go on before we can feel comfortable really judging things and what we think about them, you know.
Man, this is incredible. Is there a question that I haven't asked you or something like that that kind of pops in mind? Have you written a book, or you got a book out?
This thing about historiography that I'm talking about, I actually was edited a book of essays that deal with this exact issue. It's with Kent State University Press, and it'll be out in May, actually. It comes out in May. It's called Slavery Interpreting American History. You can find it on Amazon. Just Google my name. And it's actually several historians that wrote chapters that looked at different themes like the slave trade or slavery in the economy or slavery in the family or gender, whatever, and emancipation. I did one on emancipation, you know, and we each of us looked at how historians have changed their interpretations of this question over time. So if people are interested in that, by all means, check that out. That book will be out. I think it's May is listed for the release date. But
let me ask you this, if you don't mind, I ask you this just between you and I. When you edited the book, was there something in there that you found glaringly wrong that you said, hold on, this is between the two of us?
I mean, you know, not glaringly, you know, sometimes there might be a little clarity thing, like, are you sure you mean this or that, you know? Sometimes it's just a little mistake, you know, a typo or whatever, you know, something. I mean, there's that kind of stuff, right?
Well, I guess as I come to a close, you're in Tennessee. What's the history of Black history and where the school is located?
So Maryville College is a very interesting Black history, because our college was founded by a Presbyterian minister who was anti-slavery. And actually, one of his first students was African-American, was a slave who he immediately freed and trained him for the Presbyterian ministry, a guy named George Erskine, who ended up moving to Liberia very early on. Our college actually, you know, like a lot of places, closed during the Civil War, and then reopened immediately after the Civil War and allowed for Black and white students and men and women. It's one of the only in the country, not to mention the South, that allowed that. So, you know, our school has always had a, you know, has always tried to be on the right side of a lot of those questions. Of course, you know, later on, the state laws changed in 1902. And of course, there were some people who had opposed that integration. But then in 1954, you know, when the Brown versus Board of Ed decision, our college immediately, you know, integrated again. So, you know, a lot of
where is it located and where?
In Maryville, Tennessee, which is East Tennessee. So it's kind of in the mountains area. It's south of Knoxville and near Smoky Mountain National Park. Like right out my window, I could look and see the mountains. And,
but back in the day, it was a slave owning area.
It was, but it was not a large slavehold. So this county was about 10% enslaved, but you go to other parts of the South, it's much larger than that. There were slaves, of course, in Tennessee, everywhere, but some parts of Tennessee had a lot more slavery than other parts. You know what I mean? And so East Tennessee did not have as much slavery as West Tennessee. They didn't grow cotton here. You know, to the soil, the climate, they couldn't grow cotton here. So there were some slaves working in a hotel. There's some slaves who worked domestic in some small farm, but there was not like a plantation with 100 slaves. It didn't exist in this part of Tennessee.
I see.
If you go to Mississippi, West Tennessee, then you have the big what you think of as a slave.
Yeah, I see. Well,
it's
hey,
good.
I thank you so very much for being
Sure.
on a Strong
pleasure.
Inspirations. You've enlightened us tremendously and shared some things that I didn't know.
Sure.
And I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Absolutely.
Everybody, this is what we do is Strong Inspirations.
All right. Very good. Glad I could.
And they coming on the channel and they telling it to us and they give it to us. And you know what I'm about to say? Straight no chaser. Oh my God. I thank you so very much.
You bet.
Come on, everybody. Hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, order my movie, order my book. He's got a book coming out one day that he wrote, and we're going to edit it together and make sure it's right, so on and so forth. I thank you so very much for being on the show. And so to you, my friend, I want to say this with all sincerity, that I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind, because we really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you again for being on the show. Everybody, we out. Bye-bye.
Thank you.